Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third and final session of Net Zero Live. I'm Holly Ty, Specification Editor at Assemble Media Group, and our topic for this session is specifying for net zero carbon in the commercial sector. Achieving net zero is an important component of ESG strategies in the commercial real estate sector, but improving the energy performance of workplaces comes with its challenges. If the office sector is going to move from ambition to action, then change within the industry is very much needed. We're going to be unpacking this topic over the next hour, and you'll hear from three panellists. Today, we're joined by Peter Stocks, member of the Technical Affairs Committee at British Council for Offices, Kira Kenny, Sustainable Futures Manager at Lendlease, and Deborah Smith, the Divisional Sustainability Manager at Kingspan Data and Flooring. A huge thank you to Kingspan Data and Flooring for sponsoring this session. And a little bit of housekeeping from me before we start. If you click on resources on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll be able to download all the slides from today's session. Once we've heard from our speakers, there will be time at the end for a Q&A, so please do submit your questions throughout. And I also just wanted to flag that this session, as well as all our Net Zero Live sessions, are available free on demand via the same link that you joined by today. So if you want to rewatch or share with a colleague, then please do. Without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our first speaker. Peter, over to you.
Thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Right, my name's Peter Stocks. I'm a partner at Cundall and also a member of the BCO's Technical Affairs Committee. And I've been involved for some years now with the BCO Guide to Specification, which most people are probably aware of. For those that aren't, it's a guide to the specification best practice for new offices. It's been going for about 30 years and it gets updated every 4 or 5 years. It was to bring it up to the latest version of the building regulations and to basically update it with the standards that are current at the time of publication. We've also had, we also have a fit-out guide to specification. This hadn't been republished since it was first set out in 2011. So about 3 years ago, we started the process of updating this. However, as we were going through that process, there was a world of change going on. We were hit by COVID. We also had an absolute tsunami of changes to net zero carbon legislation. Initially, we hit some of the issues relating to the COVID, and the BCO provide a lot of publications, and we provided a lot of guidance at the time as to how we can ventilate for COVID, look after office buildings during COVID and immediately post-COVID. We also were aware that with the net zero carbon aspirations that many organisations had signed up to, and this is just a heat map showing from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, global surface temperatures to where we are now, combined with a plethora of certification processes that came around about the time of the beginning of COVID and some before that. We realised we had to, so I'm just trying to click on here, let's move that out of the way, that the BCO had to provide a little bit more information on the best way of achieving sustainability within new buildings. So we researched the market, we produced this document which was published last November, which analysed the UK Green Building Council, the LETI pathways, the REBA 2030 climate change challenge target, and gave guidance on how we felt that should be followed in the market. We're also aware that circularity and the embodied carbon is now becoming a major issue. So we published and we set out a publication on circular economy to raise the awareness of this, understand the key challenges, and set out the recommendations for the stakeholders. We actually, whilst we were updating the fit-out guide, we realised that if we were to issue that, it would contradict the main guide, which was previously or last issued in 2019. So we decided that we would update that first with an addendum to the 2019 guide, which would follow up with a full update immediately after the fit-out guide's been issued. So we've taken on board in this recent update recent changes in the net zero carbon world and changes to the way that we work post-pandemic. This table shows you a number of targets that we've now taken on board in the 2023 update to the BCO guide. The second column shows where we were in 2019, where the only real sustainability challenge target we had was for BREEAM, where the target was excellent with a minimum of very good. We were aware that a lot of our members were talking, and particularly building owners and developers were starting to feel that the BCO guide wasn't addressing these targets. So we picked up on this and we had a number of roundtable conversations with occupiers groups, agents groups, investors, and developers. And we set out where we felt the BCO guide should be, picked this up with all of those roundtable conversations. And we now have in the 23 update a series of targets for both BREEAM, which is higher than it was previously, operational carbon, neighbours rating, and embodied carbon pathways. We're aware that we're not going to be able to hit the 2050 target immediately, and as the UK GBC interim targets are set out, we believe we should be following those. So the BCO guidance is to follow the UK Green Building Council interim targets. This shows the scale that we're looking at now, where we're at somewhere between the 250, 300. But we need to get down to this total 70 kilowatt hours per square metre per year, split between the orange, which is the tenant, and the green, which is the landlord. Implications on that, on building design, are, firstly, we're reassessing the design criteria. There is the opportunity for mixed mode, to be able to switch off terminal units and equipment and to be able to use natural ventilation. Looking at occupancy criteria, which has been reassessed. We were previously talking about 1 per 10 and 1 per 8, 1 per 8 for high density offices. We're now looking at 1 per 10 as a standard. We're looking at energy consumption reduction, and previously the BCO guides 20 years ago were, in terms of small power and lighting, were significantly higher than they are now. So we're bringing those down to sort of LETI standards. There's a lot more buildings now that are going through the neighbours process, which is a star rating to indicate how green a building is. To do that, you need to understand how energy is being used. So the metering strategy, data sharing, and looking at green leases is obviously extremely important to understand where the energy is being used. Clearly eliminating fossil fuels from building and providing on-site renewables where possible. Secondly, in terms of embodied carbon, we're now setting targets for both new offices for upfront carbon, Cat A and Cat A and B fit outs. And the implications in that, some of these are being driven by local authorities, where many planning authorities are requiring developers to prove they can't reuse the existing buildings before allowing new developments. There are a lot of implications with existing buildings, and very often cores aren't in the right places, not the right sizes. But it is important to keep your embodied carbon down by minimising changes to structure wherever you can, because that becomes expensive. You always end up taking away more than you expect. There are ways of increasing areas to help pay for this upgrade, which enables you to increase your revenue stream and therefore how much you can spend on the building in the first place. And we're also looking at the implications on the fit out design. Very often tenants move out and the landlords strip everything back to a pure shell and throw everything into a skip. What we're looking at doing is what parts of the building can we reuse? Obvious ones are floor tiles, which are starting to become much more common to reuse, but there's also ductwork, which is often installed within cellular beams. It's stripped out and then you put ducts back in at the same size, in the same location, re-insulate. Same goes for cable tray, pipe work. So we're looking with a number of our clients at reusing many of the central systems, main sprinkler runs, primary ductwork runs, and also LPHW and chilled water, obviously subject to proper validation. And I think the next thing that we're going to be looking at is whole life carbon. And there are ways of analysing this now, looking at a 60-year cradle to cradle, which assumes a number of various fit outs throughout the life of a building. So it's inevitable that that's going to be part of the design process as we go forward. And again, a lot of these are being taken into planning, and the planners are starting to impose some of these onto developers and owners of buildings. So I think that's a short summary of where we are, but we do need, in terms of getting to net zero carbon, to change the way we look at buildings with new and creative solutions and try and reuse what we have there. And there are a number of projects that we're looking at the moment where, you know, we do need to change facades to get down to net zero carbon, but the facades are not old enough to change yet. So we're looking at steps to get there and trajectories to net zero carbon by doing what we can now, and then to try and change the parts of the building that would be significantly expensive in embodied carbon, and we can change those at a later date. So we've got to start thinking in different ways. So that's a short summary. If I can pass on to the next presenter.
Thank you, Peter. I know it's sometimes hard to fit that much information into such a short amount of time. Can I pass over to Kira next, please?
Yes. Hi, guys. Confirming that you can hear and see me. Yep.
Yeah,
Cool.
that's perfect. Thank you, Kira.
Great. Okay. So hi, everyone. My name is Kira. I work at Lendlease, which is a large constructor developer, and I'm your friendly internal lifecycle assessment and embodied carbon specialist. So one of the things that I'm incredibly proud of and excited about working at Lendlease is we've got some pretty ambitious science-based environmental targets. So there's two big ones. By 2025, we're committed to be net zero carbon for scope 1 and 2 emissions, and we're well on our way. And then the really exciting one for me as an embodied carbon specialist is absolute zero carbon by 2040. That is for scope 1, 2, and 3. And absolute zero carbon means that we're going to get there without offsets. And as I like to say, without excuses. So what does that look like when you step it out? Well, this is our Mission Zero roadmap. I'm not going to go through all of this here. This is publicly available if you want to peruse. And as you can see, we've got a few different things that we need to do for each one of these scopes in order to decarbonize and get to 2040. I'm going to hone in this presentation because I'm an embodied carbon specialist on our scope 3 emissions. So this is some excerpts from our Mission Zero progress, again, publicly available report. We've made some really good headway for our scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we've made a 39% reduction in our scope 1 emissions, 78% reduction in our scope 2 emissions, and a 24% reduction in our scope 3 emissions. And that reduction in scope 1 and 2 is especially impressive because we've actually increased our pipeline in that time period. So one of the things oh, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, scope 1 is essentially the fuels that you burn, scope 2 is the electricity that you use, and scope 3 is everything else. And scope 3 is probably going to be our biggest challenge. The majority of Lendlease's emissions actually sit in our scope 3, and the majority of our scope 3 is in our purchased goods and services, aka our building materials. So where do you start with such a mammoth task of decarbonizing your entire supply chain? Well, the way I like to look at it is to move a mountain, you start with the biggest rocks. So we're have a plan for all of our building components, but we're putting most of our effort at this stage in the big four. So that's your steel, concrete, aluminum, and glass. Why are they the big four? It's because we use a lot of them in buildings, and all of them at some point in their manufacturing process have a large amount of industrial heat. So they're really emissions intensive. So one of the things when you're looking at this journey to 2040 that I like to think of is it's kind of like when you're driving in a car at night and you have punched in your destination into the navigation. And so you kind of have a good idea of where you're going, but the headlights are showing that little bit of road in front of you. So this at a very high level, and I will note this is incredibly simplified version, is what our plan is, or a rough navigation for our big four materials. So for steel in the short term, you're looking at a tale of two furnaces. It's your blast furnace versus your electric arc furnace. So switching to electric arc furnace as much as possible, and then switching to electric arc furnace that's produced with 100% renewables, and then going into hydrogen steel, probably your gray-blue hydrogen first, and then going into your green hydrogen. And of course, throughout all of that is design solutions as well. You're always pulling two levers. dematerializing what you need in a design, so getting more out of less materials, circularity, and that sustainable procurement. For concrete, as you can see, a little bit more of a complicated story. So essentially, there's not a silver bullet when it comes to concrete, and there's a few horses that you have to back in that race. So in the short term, GGBS, cement replacement is still going to be a thing. Then you've also got some low carbon concrete technologies that are coming out, your PFAs, your calcine clays, your limestone fines. And then another incredibly important lever is you're actually engaging with your supply chain to decarbonize the cement kilns themselves. So, in the immediate future, I know that there's some cement kilns out there that are looking to decarbonize their emissions factors from like a zero point 0.9 to a 0.8 kilogram CO2 equivalent per kilogram down to like somewhere in the order of like a 0.6 to a 0.5. So that's a really important lever there. And then you've got some novel concrete technologies like geopolymers that are coming onto the scene as well that need to be looked at as part of that solution. And then there's the rest of concrete beyond cement. So having your low carbon aggregates and all of the other elements that go into that. And similar to steel, making sure that design solutions are a huge part of that as well. For your facade, it's mostly coming from your aluminum and your glass. So for aluminum, you're looking at aluminum produced with hydroelectricity, and then aluminum produced with high post-consumer recycled content, so around 75%. And then you get into the next phase of it, which is, okay, we've dealt with the most emissions intensive part of that aluminum journey, which is that smelting process. Now we got to look at the cathode being consumed in the electrolysis and, low embodied carbon alumina and bauxite. Um, and then for the glass, you're looking again at that high post-consumer recycled material, electrifying glass furnaces, all those sorts of things. So it's a balance between knowing what solutions are immediately available while also having an idea of where we need to go for the chunks of time between 2025 to 2030 and 2030 to 2040. Key to this is engaging with suppliers that are willing to go on this journey and has this matching or a greater level of ambition to get these technologies and solutions in place at the same time as us. So what does that look like on a practical level or for a project? Well, at organizational level, we've set those targets, and those targets lead to good roadmaps, and those roadmaps lead to each of the regions that we work out of. So we're working out of Australia, the US, Asia, and Europe. So each of those regions will have their own individual roadmaps, and then that'll lead to mandates and processes. Which would look like, you need to procure this emissions intensity of carbon steel glass by these dates or from these suppliers. Here's the processes for collecting data. And then you're also leveraging supply chain conversations that are happening at a global level. So again, working with those partners that are going to come with us on that journey to 2040. That then leads to good, consistent specifications and sort of trickles down to informed project targets. So those project targets are connected directly to emission zero, and they're well informed and have a lot of benchmarking behind them. So what this would look like for a project is that opportunity and origination phase, so like your RIVA 0 to 1. That's when you're leveraging benchmark to make sure that you're setting targets that are ambitious yet viable. And you're looking at some of the things that can change at that point. So that's where you're making big decisions around what type of structure should this be? How much of the building do we reuse? Then in your concept design, that's where you're creating these reduction roadmaps. So a whole shopping list of embodied carbon reduction initiatives that get swapped and changed to work out what's the best and optimal approach for this project, and how can we leverage the best practice that we're seeing on other projects in our portfolio so that an individual project doesn't sit there as its own little island of excellence and sustainability. We're sharing that knowledge across the organization. And then another key point is at procurement and subcontractor engagement. So making sure that those suppliers are aware of those embodied carbon reduction initiatives and the data that they need to provide and engagement that's required in order to pull those off. And then you get into detailed design and as-built, and essentially there you're just collecting really good data so that you can feed it back to the beginning of this roadmap, which is having good benchmarking to set quality targets. So just a quick example of what that might look like in practice. This is an example project whose name I removed, where essentially we looked at a few different structural options. It was like a post-tension, a different steel hybrid option. And for each of those, we set a moderate and a stretch reduction scenario. So we didn't just say, oh, well, there's less precedent for that initiative, or, that's a newer product. We said, okay, well, what would it look like if we took on those reduction initiatives that we have some precedent for and don't have any cost to time and program. And then for stretch scenarios, what would happen if we went all out, and try to work out with our clients what balance between those different initiatives we actually want to go and deliver. And really excited to see where we go in the future based off this. So that's really, really high level. And that is me. I think that's all my time.
Thank you so much, Kira. I liked your point about working with suppliers that are wanting to go on the journey with you. I think that's a really important part of the jigsaw puzzle. Can I welcome our last speaker, Deborah, please?
Hi there. I will just share my slides. So my name is Deborah Smith. I am the Sustainability Manager for Kingspan Data and Flooring. And I'll just begin a little bit on our Planet Passionate strategy and then delve into kind of our product and what we're doing there to innovate and evolve in terms of lower embodied carbon solutions. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions is absolutely essential to addressing the climate crisis. Existing buildings and construction are responsible for around 39% of annual global emissions. And at Kingspan, we're really aware of the need to create more sustainable products for the industry. And this is why we have developed what we feel is an industry leading sustainability strategy called Planet Passionate. So it outlines 12 key targets under the areas of energy, carbon, circularity, and water that will help mitigate our corporate emissions and reach net zero carbon manufacturing by 2030. So, key initiatives like procuring renewable energy or increasing our own capabilities to generate energy on site using solar PV, zero waste landfill, and water saving initiatives are all key parts of this strategy. But I suppose for the purpose of today's discussion, I'll focus on carbon and our commitment to the 50% reduction in product CO2 intensity from our primary supply partners by 2030, which will greatly advance our mission to net zero. So net zero is really critical for tackling climate change. And at Kingspan Data and Flooring, our vision is to accelerate a net zero built environment by bringing to market innovative, high performing, lower carbon solutions. We're on a journey here to reduce the embodied carbon of our raised access floor solutions, and we've listened to our customers and to the industry. We've looked at the guidelines and the benchmarks, and we're now thankfully in a position to offer a new market first solution with our RMG 600 plus, which has achieved a significant reduction in its embodied carbon. So our new product has just launched, and it offers the same level of confidence and performance, but with a significant improvement in its environmental performance, which the industry and the likes of architects, specifiers, and developers have been asking for. So our new PSA approved RMG 600 Plus is our lowest ever embodied carbon raised access floor panel, and it's the first of its kind. It demonstrates minus 3.04 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per panel across modules A1 to A3 in its life cycle, and has a 57% reduction per panel across modules A to C when compared to the previous EPD for the standard version of the product RMG 600. So, Kira already mentioned electric arc furnace, and the inclusion of electric arc furnace steel in this product paired with high recycled content wood means that this product has a minimum of 86% recycled content. So achieving the PSA 2021 standard was really essential as well in this process, so that we can offer a 25-year warranty with this product. And we are delighted to be able to bring this product to the market at a time when net zero is really critical. So hopefully this product will enhance, all different schemes and developments that it will be installed in, and any that have kind of high sustainability expectations, and really support those green building certificates such as BREEAM LEED and the WELL standard. So again, onto the electric arc furnace steel. So I suppose choosing lower carbon, higher recycled content materials is really critical to our product evolution. So electric arc furnace steel was really transformational in the manufacturing process here. It's a lower carbon solution for steel production when compared to what we would typically see in traditional blast furnaces, which rely heavily on coal and coke for fuel. And it's a really carbon intensive process. So this switch is very different. They can be powered by renewable energy, like sources such as wind and solar power. And using recycled metal reduces the amount of new steel that needs to be produced. And in our particular case, we're using 90% scrap metal in our new steel. It also reduces the need for raw materials such as iron ore to be produced, which is a really energy intensive product to mine and to transport. So this process emits fewer greenhouse gases during the process. So going from around 2.1 tons of carbon emitted per ton of steel to around zero point 0.6 tons of carbon emitted per ton of steel produced. And really investing in this technology is really key to ensuring that more and more of these methods exist and are accessible to our industry. So we will see a shift and a transition to electric arc furnace, low carbon steel, and as a business, we're really glad to be at the front of this in the UK and Irish markets. And we feel that we're in a unique position now to facilitate the decarbonisation of the commercial office built environment and the shift towards net zero. So I'll just finish off now with kind of what we've done so far this year and where we're going. In February, we verified and published our EPD to show the environmental performance of the product, and this really is our key benchmarking process to determine the environmental impact of our processes and our products. Then in February, we invested in a material passport with a company called 2050 Materials, and this um, declaration really offers an accessible and digestible document showing the main facts of the product and also provides an easier way for architects and specifiers and the industry in general to understand our product. We are now currently in the position to produce RMG 600 Plus at scale, and from June, we will be distributing the product to flagship projects throughout the UK and Ireland to really support that net zero built environment. In 2024, we will be expanding on our LEC range, so lower embodied carbon range, with more PSA products coming on the market to provide more lower carbon alternatives. And then from 2026 and beyond, we will be looking to introduce H2 green steel into the Kingspan product range. So the production of H2 green steel emits around 95% less CO2 than emitted by traditional methods. So just another step up from electric arc furnace steel. And to conclude, really, I suppose this is a journey that we're really committed to continuing on and investing in, and we want to support, our shared focus in decarbonisation of the built environment. And in Kingspan Data and Flooring, we're delighted that our new RMG 600 Plus will greatly help us to achieve our own goals, but then also support the industry goals as well. So that's all from me.
Thank you so much, Deborah. That was a really great presentation. Can I welcome all the speakers back onto the screen, and then we can kick off the Q&A. Perfect. I'm going to throw out a broad question to start with. What are the main barriers when it comes to specifying for net zero in the workplace? And I guess more importantly, how do you all think they can be overcome?
I can start that one. I think for us as a manufacturer, it's really important to have access to these different types of materials that have a lesser impact on the environment, and ensuring that the suppliers that we're working with are as committed to sustainability as we are, and really understanding our expectations and demands and our customers' expectations and demands as well, and providing that transparent data, that transparent information, and investing as much as we are in their own processes to decarbonize their own sectors.
Yeah, completely agree. I think that especially when your supply chain is multiple layers deep and where the main emissions are happening, like it does require that collaboration across your supply chain is really important. I think from a developer constructor point of view, having good processes is incredibly important. So having like universal embodied carbon specification clauses that are incredibly specific about the requirements and performance, so you can have those conversations with suppliers early about what exactly is required of them, is really important. But if I'm going with obstacles, I don't think that the main obstacles for decarbonizing our industry is in technological advances. I think the main obstacle is the fact that everyone in their own slice of whatever part of the supply chain or puzzle they're in, um, it's very easy to kind of point fingers saying like, oh, well, I don't have control over that bit. They have control over that bit. Or like, oh, it's cost planning, or it's architects, or it's the client, or it's this or that. And it's really easy to point fingers at other slices of the pie and say that, oh, well, I can't do anything because of the control that someone else has. But I think if we come together more and collaborate on those obstacles and work out what is and isn't a real obstacle, and sort of work on our own bits of control and what we do have control over, then I think we would get a lot more done.
Yeah, mindset change. Peter, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think one is cost. I think at the moment, certainly in the offices sector, the office sector has been hit by COVID, hybrid working patterns, people not knowing quite how much space they need and want. So demand has been a bit shaky. I think rental levels have held up reasonably well despite that, and there are a lot of people moving now. But I think for both new buildings and also existing buildings that are being refurbished, there's a real challenge to be able to hit all these net zero carbon challenges and also do it in a cost-effective way. Over the last 2 or 3 years of Brexit, COVID, material costs have risen dramatically, labour costs have risen, and the developers now, when they're trying to either build or refurbish existing buildings, are having great difficulty in making it all stack up. They're aware that they've got to decarbonise the buildings, because if it doesn't hit every target, neighbours 5-star, BREEAM outstanding, net zero carbon, then tenants aren't going to be looking at it, because most tenants have got their own net zero carbon policies that they've signed up to globally. We're involved in a number of those for tenants who are working with landlords to try and decarbonise their properties. So I think there's a real challenge there in terms of costs. I think in terms of embodied and operational carbon, I think embodied carbon is a massive challenge because there isn't enough data there yet. And I know Kira and Deborah have been talking about suppliers and supply chains. I think it's fine when you're talking about the major elements such as steel beams, concrete floors, foundations, whatever, even as far as raised floors and ceilings. But once you start getting down to things like fan core units and chillers, and there's so many components that go into it, right from grommets to printed circuit boards, and every single bit needs to have its embodied carbon measured somehow. And that's a massive challenge to cascade that down through the whole supply chain to get the right level of information to be able to show that we're doing what we need to be doing. And I think in terms of operational carbon, a lot of existing buildings don't have sufficient information as to how the energy is being used within the building. More modern buildings and refurbished buildings that are being designed for performance standard and neighbour standards do have requirements in terms of metering of loads, so you can understand where the energy is being used. So I think that's starting to happen, but there's still only like 10% of the stock that in the UK particularly that has that level of understanding of how energy is being used. And I think some of the new methodologies like the neighbours and the design for performance neighbours will help that, because once a building that's been given a design rating for neighbours is 75% occupied, you then start annually reassessing it and analysing how the data is being used, and your neighbour's rating will go up or down depending on how that building is being operated. So it's all going to be about how the building's operated, and there's going to be massive pressure on the facilities management side to make sure that they don't lose their neighbours' ratings. So I think they're the sort of three biggies for me: cost, embodied, and operational carbon.
Yeah, there's a lot of barriers, isn't there? Do you think it's going to be a long road ahead?
I think there's a willingness to do it.
Yeah.
There's a need to do it because, certainly most organisations, and we've been involved with one or two, both, sort of 2 or 3 in London, a couple in Belfast, where clients have said, look, we've signed up to global policy for net zero carbon, to hit net zero carbon by 2030. This building doesn't support it. And I think there are buildings that now are of a right design to be able to accommodate the modern building services. 60s buildings didn't have the story height, couldn't be air conditioned, they had wrong facades. Modern buildings have those story heights, have the ability to be properly serviced. We're looking at a few now where the facades are only 15, say 20 years old. So there's another 15 plus years life in them, but they may be full height glazing. The U values and G values might not be appropriate for net zero carbon type buildings. And I think I mentioned it in my speech that it's too early to rip it off, throw it in the bin, and then all that embodied carbon that's used to put a new facade on will never offset the operational savings that you get. So there's got to be a sort of trajectory where you can do as much as you can now at a sensible cost. You're not going to strip the facade off, particularly if it's part tenanted, although there's ways and means of doing it sort of piecemeal if you can free up parts of the building, although it becomes more expensive. So it's really trying to manage that sort of change on the existing buildings and to hit as the whole life carbon targets become available, to be able to minimize those changes to the building, because the whole life carbon sort of cycle of 60 years assumes a number of fit outs and assumes two changes of facade and assumes various other factors. So you've got to try and keep within that to enable your whole life carbon to be minimized.
Circling back to your point, because we talked about willingness, and I think Kira also mentioned about that idea of pointing fingers and a mindset change. One of the key messages in the BCO's report on delivering net zero carbon in the workplace, it said that a fundamental cultural change in our perception of the workplace is needed if we've got any kind of chance of achieving net zero. How close do you think we are to achieving that? Just because you mentioned a willingness.
Well, I think it is going to be difficult because, I mean, there's a couple of instances where we've been dealing with legal firms who have specific ways of working and they don't want to change those. Yeah. But unless you change those ways of working, for example, switching their air conditioning on at 5 in the morning and leaving it on until 9 or 10 at night because somebody might be working early or late, and having it on Saturdays as well. If you want to reduce your operational carbon, you're going to have much shorter running periods and let the inertia of the building deal with it for those periods outside, or be able to move to a part of the building where you can deal with it separately and switch all the main systems off, so you can reduce the amount of energy being used down to that small area that people can work in. But you'll get people who say, well, I can't because all my books are here and I want to be able to access them, and I'm not going to be traipsing up 3 floors to try and get them. So it's a cultural change for some organizations, and the whole perception of providing the best office space to attract and retain the best staff and giving health and well-being up front, by opening windows in cities where buses are whizzing up and down and switching terminal units off to save energy and carbon, isn't really going to help. It's getting better now in most cities with ultra low emission zones, with electric cars, buses, taxis, but it's going to be a gradual change to get to that point, I think. Yeah.
Deborah and Kira, you're both coming from different perspectives. Did you have something to add?
Yeah. I'd say, now I can't speak for other organizations. I can only really speak to what I've seen at Lend-Lease. Having that target set has created that sense of urgency. And I think as we go about trying to solve these problems and setting those pathways, it has become incredibly apparent that sustainability cannot happen in a vacuum. Sustainability is now part of everybody's job description in order to do it effectively. And I think that has created a huge attitude shift. Even in the last couple of years, I am now involved with cost planning conversations, supply chain conversations, more commercial conversations, all talking and more client facing conversations all about how are we going to do this in a way that meets that matrix of like, risk, price, time, availability, program, and hits all of those things. And to touch on your point, Peter, where you spoke about cost, my favorite reduction initiatives are the ones that not only reduce embodied carbon, but reduce costs as well. And when you're looking at value engineering and dematerialization, like switching your columns, for example, from a low strength to a high strength steel reduces the amount of steel that you need in your overall embodied carbon, and it happens to save money. If we're talking about office fit outs, funnily enough, we have moved from our region square headquarters to an office in Paddington. And as part of that, we actually measured the embodied carbon of the fit out, and through applying some reuse and circular initiatives, along with low embodied carbon specification of the new materials that were coming in, we were able to reduce our embodied carbon by 29% compared to like a business as usual model. Now I'll have to check that against the targets that you had mentioned earlier and see how well we fared. But a lot of that was also a cost saving thing as well. So I think busting myths and perceptions that sustainability has to be difficult and has to be expensive is going to be a big part of making that happen faster.
Yeah, completely agree with what you initially said, Kira. Like my job as a sustainability manager touches every part of the business, and I feed into other people's roles and they equally feed into my role, and it's definitely a joint effort, and that kind of determination and commitment has to be fed from the top down as well. And we know as a manufacturer, we have to be on board. We have to support this shift, this transition towards lower carbon solutions in order to support our customers in their own. It's not just about us, it's about our customers' own journeys as well. So yeah, it's definitely not a siloed thing at all. It has to touch every single part of the business. And I think that shift is definitely happening. A couple of years ago, people didn't really understand sustainability or understand the benefits of it to the business, whereas now it's completely essential. So yeah, it's a really good shift, I think.
Thank you, Deborah. We have a question on incentives. The pursuit of net zero is arguably primarily driven by ESG objectives, client expectations, and public pressure to respond to the climate emergency. Does the panel think a more proactive approach from the government is needed to drive this ambition forward? And if so, what would you like that to look like? Does anyone want to go first, or would you like me to pick on someone?
Sorry, I was just checking the attendee questions there as you said that. Can you repeat?
Sorry. Do you think the pursuit of net zero is arguably driven by kind of ESG objectives? Do you think a more proactive approach from the government is needed to drive that ambition forward? And if so, what would you like it to look like?
So, okay, like for context, I've just moved over from the Australian business and into the European business, so I won't pretend to comment on UK and European politics. But I usually see this type of innovation and change where like the private sector is sort of leading and government will come along. Obviously, it will help. Obviously, it will help. I don't know exactly what it would look like, but for me, I think the bigger incentive is actually the financial side of things. So a lot of these big companies have set these sustainability targets because they realize they're not here for one election cycle. They want to be here for decades, and sustainable companies will make more money and will be here for longer. It is a sign of a company that's thriving. And when you're looking at financial institutions and the insurers that insure insurers, they're looking at climate change adaptation and resilience and mitigation, because nobody makes money on a dead planet. Right. So I think that the bigger carrot is actually it makes financial sense to be sustainable long term. And I'm hopeful that government catches up to that mentality as well.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And the conversations we're having with the larger investors and portfolio owners is exactly that the investors want to make sure their money's safe. They want to make sure their buildings are future-proofed and hit the targets before the targets are actually there. So I think even though the government signed up to this net zero carbon by 2050, Paris Accord, I think that it's going to be more supply driven than a demand from the government to do it. So, and I think I'm seeing that a lot of our clients are vying between themselves to be more sustainable than others, to attract, tenants in the office market space in particular, but also in other sectors, into their buildings. So I think that's driving it more than setting newer targets on building regulations.
Yeah, and we do see the guidance coming out, like the Letty guidance, for instance, and it's very important, and we do see companies trying to get on board with that to have that competitive advantage. But there definitely is legislation coming in, like there's the example of the Sustainable Products Initiative coming in the next couple of years, whereby products will have to come with a passport or some type of information around where it's come from, and then its end of life possibilities or options, and that's legislation. So definitely there is going to be, I think, that shift where it's going to be governing rather than just legislated rather than just guidance.
On your point, Deborah, about material passports, how similar to EPDs, how important do you think EPDs and kind of relevant sustainability documentation is?
Yeah, really, really important. I think we're all very aligned in understanding the importance of this data and data transparency and the accuracy of that information in terms of what the climate impacts of products are. Um, for us as a manufacturer, EPDs are very, very essential to our business. It's something that we're asked for, along with the likes of VOC documents, health product declarations, now material passports, something that we're asked for all the time. For us, it's a really, really good way of understanding our product, where it comes from, what its impact is, setting a benchmark for ourselves so that we can, okay, we have this number now, but in 2 years' time, what will that number look like in terms of kilograms of embodied carbon in a product? So constantly improving and driving forward, driving down our carbon, but then equally so critical for our customers to understand um, the impacts of our products for their own carbon calculations within the full building scheme or development. So yes, those pieces of information are very essential, and it's quite an investment in terms of resources and an investment financially, but very critical to understanding the impacts of the built environment.
Thank you. Kira, you're nodding. I'm assuming.
Yeah, sorry. Like from the demand, I talk about EPDs every day. So from the demand side, it's no longer going to be a nice to have, but a need to have. The first step in your decarbonization journey is understanding where you're at, and even that is a mammoth task. Every single tender from every single supplier, we are demanding environmental product declarations. So if this is the first time you're hearing about it or being asked for it, it will not be the last, and it'll become the new business as usual. And chain to custody, materials passports, that level of transparency is going to be asked for a number of reasons. Risk, modern slavery, and sustainability. So there's a ton of reasons why that's important and why we really, really do care about it.
Brilliant. Thank you. We had another question on, I think, data sharing. Is it intended that all this progress will be recorded centrally using data from different organisations and projects? How do you envisage this will be done?
I love the idea. I think it's, yeah. I will say construction in general is a more competitive space historically, and sustainability has been this one little niche where I have seen huge amounts of collaboration and willingness to share data. And groups like UKGBC, Letty, I was involved in the MECLA group in Australia, Materials and Body Carbon Leadership Alliance. I've seen data sharing done through organizations like that, where people come together. But having a central place, I think, would be a great idea. I just think it's a little, the way that organizations currently work, it's probably a little far off. But we could get more done together, for sure.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's going to be very difficult for the smaller components. But I think when it comes to buildings and neighbours' ratings, for example, they're all going to be published online. Yeah. People will be able to see how different buildings are operating, and there will be pressure on the owners and operators to make sure that they are working correctly. And we've got a number of offices in Australia where they've been running the neighbours scheme for the last 10, 15 years. And our guys have been involved heavily with a lot of the facilities teams for various client organisations over there to understand how their operational energy changes and what causes it to, if somebody leaves something in manual and air handling units on all night, you can suddenly see this change in energy use and patterns. So it's just absolutely being on top of it for those kind of issues.
Thank you. I saw on one of your slides, Peter, you shared lots of logos from all the different initiatives that are currently underway, and one of them was WELL. And we kind of can't escape the knowledge that healthy buildings create happy and very productive individuals, particularly when it comes to kind of workplaces. I had a question, do you think there's much crossover between specifying for net zero and specifying for WELL, or are we going to get to a point where designers kind of have to choose between the two?
It's a little bit of both, because things like, fresh air, the more fresh air, the better, up to a certain extent. Whereas the more air you push into a building, the more energy you need to do that. So there are some contradictions there, but I think that, biophilia, that the way space is planned, I think all of those don't necessarily cost a lot of money. So I think from a financial point of view, there aren't too many conflicts. I think from, we're looking at mixed mode. I think I mentioned it in the slides, to be able to open windows, which is, it's becoming more of a norm in the city as the streets are becoming quieter and less polluted. So I think there are opportunities to do that. Without a doubt, WELL we had it for our office in London here, we had the first WELL building certificate in Europe, and we've now rolled it out across for many of our clients, looking at Crown Estate, WELL Platinum. And there isn't a massive cost. There was initially, because people had the perception that you had to do loads for it, but it's clever design, it's using the right materials, it's, you can do it without it being too expensive, and also without it using too much carbon. So I think it is possible, but there are some contradictions there, definitely.
We touched briefly on energy intensive materials and how, I know, Kira, you were talking about how to decarbonise our supply chain. There are initiatives underway, and Deborah, you mentioned in your presentation about H2 green steel. I was wondering if you could explain that to people that haven't heard it before and what it is.
Yeah, so H2 Green Steel it's a really exciting company. They're based in Sweden, and basically what they're doing is they're pioneering new or lower carbon production methods for steel. They're using renewable energy, and they're replacing the coal in the steelmaking process with green hydrogen. And it's a really, really low carbon process. The main emissions coming from that process are heat and water, and the output, the end product of the steel, has 95% less CO2 in it than what we would see today from traditional basic oxygen furnaces. So it's a really transformational process and end product. And I think Kingspan invested 10 million euro into this business in 2021. So we're hoping to be kind of at the forefront of this when it comes online in 2026, and be able to implement that into our products. So I think that's going to be really transformational. And Kira already kind of touched on it, and the Lend Lease kind of trajectory as well, looking at those different products. So yeah, really excited to be kind of in the mix for a product like that. And I think it's the shift that we need to make as a manufacturer, and the investments that we need to make as a manufacturer. So yeah, we're keen to kind of keep looking at different technologies like that. But H2 Green Steel are definitely very impressive, and the results seem good. So we'll watch that space.
It's interesting. We've been involved in a couple of projects recently with some of our major portfolio owners who are, dismantling rather than demolishing buildings. And, one of the projects we've been looking at recently has been trying to reuse the steel from one building onto another, with a little bit of finishing and it has to go back to the factory, it has to be tested, it has to be finished properly. But the structural engineer in this particular project took all the beam sizes from one of the other buildings and decided which bits he could reuse. And then, that will be, I think, a new sort of industry almost, in terms of taking beams out of buildings, storing them somewhere and having a directory of them. So when people want to build a new building, they can go to one of these steel yards and say, I want so many of this site, and they can sift through what they've got and see if they can actually find it there. And I think that is by far the cheapest way of reusing steel, rather than having to melt it down and to recycle, turn it into a new beam, for example. So that could be a new challenge for the industry.
Yeah. I think it's definitely a combination of the two, as always. The greenest material is the one that already exists. And then in cases where either like it doesn't line up with the program or it wasn't suited to that design and you need some new steel, then it's about looking at what's the lowest on the market. And hydrogen's definitely on the horizon. I think in the European market, there's some pilot plants that are producing hydrogen steel right now, but the automotive industry snuck in before the building industry, and they've got a hold on the current stock. So it's just making sure that construction is very, very clear with its demand signaling and make sure that we're next in line, and are able to get our hands on that and invest to make sure that there's more supply of that super low carbon steel in the market, and it'll permeate throughout several parts of our buildings, not just our structural steel, but in our flooring and in our wall partitions. And so in that high level diagram I'd shown, that's just on a material basis. That's not even getting into the complications of MEP and what you need to do to decarbonize those parts and all of your finishes. But yeah, really, really exciting space.
Thank you. We've had tons of questions on slides being available. If anyone's having any issues downloading slides, please don't worry. We will make sure that they are available for everyone at the end of the session. We've only got a few minutes left, so I think I'm going to end by asking everyone if they can just share, what they want people to walk away from this session fresh on their mind, their key takeaways, kind of what we've discussed today. Who wants to start?
Yeah, I can start. I think the climate crisis is so important, and it's at a really critical time. It's something that we're all aware of, and it's affecting every aspect of society. And obviously, our businesses are really cognizant of what we need to do, what are our responsibilities in the grand scheme of things. And for us as a manufacturer, I think it's really important that we're constantly out there trying to find the solutions, trying to find the raw materials, trying to drive down that carbon in our own sector so we can support the wider sector. But yeah, it's really exciting to have these types of conversations and kind of share different thoughts and different aspects from different areas of the industry. So but yeah, it is kind of up to us as the manufacturer to bring those solutions to our customers. So yeah.
Yeah, I think from my point, something Kira said, which is the greenest material is the material that's already in existence. And I think one of the things that we've seen a lot of when we're talking about reusing existing is, and again, it comes over to Deborah, which is floor tiles, which traditionally used to be stripped out, put a brand new shiny one down because the agents can sell it. But nowadays, people are accepting of the fact that there's hardly anything that can go wrong with the floor tile, and as long as it's got, I think you mentioned there, 25-year warranties. What's the point of ripping it out after 10 years and throwing it away? So I think there's a lot of how can we reuse what we've got, and that goes not just from floor tiles, but in existing buildings, major risers. Obviously, they've got to be tested, pipework particularly, ductwork easier, on floor, what can we reuse? Fan core units, somebody may have only been in there sort of 8 or 9 years. Strip it out, start again. And a lot of advisors for tenants are coming in saying, oh, it's not going to have a warranty, so get rid of it, we want brand new. And I think it's changing their perception and changing tenants' perceptions and building occupiers' perceptions that, terminal units, it's a fan and a motor and a coil. It's very little can go wrong and it's relatively cheap to repair. So we've got to reuse as much as we possibly can. That's my major takeaway.
Kira?
For me, I would say with a problem so big, it's very easy to get disheartened. But don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can. Really focus on what's in your little slice of control. And I guess the other main thing is you got to get really good at busting perceptions and busting myths.
Yep.
So, and the way that you do that is through good collaboration and communication with stakeholders and excellent data. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for. So a huge thank you to all our speakers. You've been really generous with your time and your expertise, so we're very grateful for that. It was lovely to hear from you all, and thank you to everyone that tuned in at home as well.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.